Hello everybody, it's Laura. Welcome to this session that will explore the education of children and young people labelled as having profound and multiple learning difficulties. Now, one of the things that I love about working alongside children with this label is that it really makes us question what the purpose of education is and what it could be. And I often wish that ordinary school classrooms had some of the qualities found in classrooms frequented by children with this label. So in this session we're going to do a quick overview of how education has developed for children described as having PMLD, and then we'll explore some of the approaches that are typically seen and how these have been influenced by psychology. So it was suggested that an IQ of 55 was the cut-off point at which a child could be educated in a special school, and teachers were warned not to be sentimental about reporting what they referred to as detrimental or low-grade children to the health authority. Children with PMLD remained the responsibility of the health authorities until 1970 Education Act. When they were finally legally entitled to an education, which was to be provided by the local education authorities. And whilst doctors were securing their expertise in the care and control of the mentally defective, the new science of psychology was gaining momentum, which further influenced understandings of and approaches to, in inverted commas, treating children described as having PMLD. When the government legislated that a national curriculum would be introduced in 1988, a curriculum that should be taught to all children, some teachers mounted a fierce resistance to the idea that they were to teach children labelled with PMLD subjects like science or history, for example. And in 1997, around 34% of teachers who educated children described with this label opposed the content-driven national curriculum. By the end of the 1990s then, the School's Curriculum and Assessment Authority, SCAR, had produced guidance entitled Planning the Curriculum for Pupils with Profound and Multiple Learning Difficulties. And from this, a new framework was introduced in 1998, which provided a means of assessing children who were said to be working below level 1 of the ordinary national curriculum. And this framework became known as P-scales. So early work in behaviourism, cognitivism and developmental psychology is really what paved the way for not only what today many people think PMLD is, but also in how pedagogical processes, approaches are developed and used with learners with this label. Building on the notion of developmental norms in children, those skills deemed to be prerequisite to learning have become the focus of pedagogical practice, such as teaching children communication skills, cognitive skills, and motor skills. And when you look at the learning activities that are going on in the PMLD classroom, these are generally underpinned by cognitive psychology or behavioural psychology. And I want to look at just a couple of these here. So many teaching approaches underpinned by behaviourism usually use operant conditioning theory. Here a learner is given a stimulus each time a discrete behaviour is performed in the hope that this will increase the likelihood of that behaviour reoccurring. So, for example, when I used to assess a child's hearing, I would start by playing a loudish noise, and when the child looked up towards the sound, they would be instantly rewarded with some flashing lights or dancing puppets, for example. They would then learn that when I hear a sound, I will get to see those funny puppets. Got a bit of Pavlov's dogs about it, don't you think? Such approaches can be used either to encourage behaviour that is deemed more positive or appropriate, for example, making a particular vocalisation and then receiving a preferred activity. Or it can be used to discourage a behaviour that is considered negative or inappropriate. So, for example, if a child stops flapping their hands, then they get a preferred activity. These activities can often take place in sensory rooms, and I do want to caution you about some of the claims that can be made about the benefits of sensory rooms. So let us just be clear, and I'm just showing images here of a whole range of different types of multisensory environments, from the whole kind of white room with various kind of hanging chairs, different lighting effects, mirrors. There's now the hydrosensory room that some places are introduction. There's images there of the classic bubble tube. There's a little homemade one, which is like a tent, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And then there's more of a kind of soft play area type multi-sensory room with a ball pool. I just want to be clear that sensory rooms are wonderful spaces to spend time. I've had some of my most treasured moments career-wise messing about, you know, on a waterbed with a child, giggling with them, etc. The concept of the multisensory environment actually came from something that we used to refer to, and still occasionally is referred to, as the snoezeling. And this was a Dutch concept, with the term snoezeling actually being a blend of the two Dutch words meaning to snuggle and to doze. So when they were first introduced, they were for no other purpose than enjoyment and pleasure. But since then, they've been colonised by a range of professionals staking claims of about what can be achieved in them. And there's been lots of research about the efficacy of these claims, and all conclude that they don't do anything other than enable children and young people to be in calming and safe spaces, to be able to move, explore, relax. And for me, what they really promote is the opportunity to be with others, to get to know one another, to play. And to be honest, something that I tend to find lacking in the PMLD classroom is the opportunity for children to be together with each other, close up. Often because each child has got an individual programme of learning. They can be sat in classrooms only working with the learning support assistant or teacher as an individual. Children don't tend to collaborate like they might in other classrooms, and even if they do something as a group, for example, then they're often still very far apart from one another because of wheelchairs and a learning support assistant sat in between each person in a wheelchair. And so the sensory room can be a space for children to be close to one another. And I suppose another argument here for me is that providing a safe space for children to do this does not require thousands of pounds worth of equipment. And it's important for you to recognise the part that equipment companies play in promoting their ridiculously overpriced wares. There is a link on this slide so you can have a little look yourself. But I've taken a couple of screenshots here to give you some idea. So bubble panel there, from £700 to £1,350. That doesn't include that. There's a bubble tube mat. That's just the mat, £300, about between £300 and £500. A cube control bubble tube, £1,385 to £1,885. An eclipse ceiling panel, £875. Fibre optic carpet, £1,495. A 3D nebula ceiling panel, £895. Yeah. Tomlinson talks about this idea of a Zen industry, and thinking about this concept, there is something of a market that particularly targets parents, teachers and therapists of children labelled with PMLD, and I've just written PMLD industry on this slide. It's not necessary to pay these obscene amounts of money. It's not necessary to have to rely on this kind of equipment in order to make spaces that are safe and calm and relaxing, where children can spend time out of their wheelchairs, time together, etc. For sure, if you want to put in nice lighting, etc., etc., get yourself to Home Bargain or B&M. It's much, much cheaper. Next then, I want to think about an approach that is underpinned more by cognitivism. So Dave Hewitt and Melanie Nines built on the work of a psychologist called Geraint Ephraim back in the 80s in a school that was attached to an old institution for people with learning difficulties. And Ephraim had developed this approach that he called augmented mothering. And so this approach came from studying the way that mothers interacted with their babies and looked at their use of eye contact, mimicking of sounds, exaggerated facial expression, for example. Nines and Hewitt developed this into an approach that we now call intensive interaction, and it's become a way of moving away from behavioural approaches, which, let's face it, are a little like dog training in principles and questionable, I would argue. And so the aims of intensive interaction are around developing what some call early communication skills. But I think what is important is some of Dave's more recent work, where he's starting to push back a little at the way in which, again, intensive interaction has been turned into something that is very kind of task orientated, lots of tick charts in order to measure, this whole idea of measuring what's happening, how a child is developing, etc. And since all through the 90s, really, as intensive interaction started to become much more kind of popular in schools, then because in particular it had been brought into education, then some of that obsession with objectives and measuring particular objectives started to I guess impact how many of us were doing intensive interaction and thinking about intensive interaction and its whole purpose. And so I was pleased that in 2012 then Hewitt started to talk about this idea that it was process central. So it was not about it shouldn't be task orientated. It's not about producing something. It's about the process. It's about what's happening in that moment. And what I'd like you to do now is to just pause this video, go to the link that's in the description section below the recording in YouTube, and I want you to watch that clip, and I want you to note down what you think is being learnt. Okay, so typically people may want to focus intensive interaction sessions on what they understand as developmental norms. And on the screen here, I'm showing a typical linear representation of supposedly how children develop communication. And as I've argued in previous sessions, developmental norms are problematic. And in fact, I would encourage you to read some of Berman's work. And here I'm just showing one of her many publications, which is the image of a book called Deconstructing Developmental Psychology, which is now in its third edition. For me, the young person that you've just watched in that clip has learnt many things. They've learnt that they're good to be with. They've learnt that they're a nice person. They've learnt that they've got agency, that they are able to do things that influence how other people behave. They've learnt that interacting with other people is fun and it's pleasurable. And for me, these are more important. And if you ever get the opportunity to do intensive interaction, then I would encourage you to not go down the route of endless checklists or tick boxes following an intensive interaction session. Spend more time really reflecting on the moment shared, and perhaps use questions like the ones on the slide to document this work. So what happened last time? What's happened this time? What was different? Some of you might remember the story that I read called Karen. And I'm doing intensive interaction with Karen. And you might remember that right at the end of it, I finished the story as I'm writing up in the speech therapy file what has just happened in that intensive interaction session. But actually what I don't do is capture really anything, any of the essence of what has truly just taken place in that session. So I'm wanting to encourage you to think about that. And I was also delighted in Hewitt's more recent publication that he made this statement here. So he said, don't just focus on the visible outer behaviours. And again, you might want to just pause this recording and note down what you think is meant by this. For me, one of the things that prompted me to do the research that I did was about trying to find explanations as to why that moment I shared with Karen felt like such a big and full moment of interaction, of relationship with that learner. And there's a whole range, you know, of theories that we can draw on to kind of expand on the idea that Hewitt was pointing to there in terms of only ever looking for outward visible behaviours. But I just want to introduce you just briefly to an idea as put forward by Martin Buber, who is a philosopher who thinks about relationships, two types of relationships. He wrote a book called I, Thou, and he talks about the idea of an I-Thou relationship and an I-It relationship. And in the I-Thou relationship, which for me is what happens in so many of my encounters with children who are described as having PMLD, I feel there is an I-Thou relationship. So ihdu is how Buber referred to it. So Buber stressed that an ihdu, I thou relationship, lacks any composition, any structure, yeah, and it communicates no content, yeah. And despite the fact that I thou cannot be proven to happen as an event, yeah, it cannot be measured, Buber stressed that it is real and perceivable. And for me, this is something that I found has really helped in my thinking about the relationships that I often form with people with the label of PMLD, um, um, and how I can make sense of that connection. And there is my references. See you soon, everyone.